Okay, so to start off, it's important for us to have just a broad understanding of what it means to be a tenant. And so uh, this is a definition we've taken over from the Los Angeles Tenants Union and some other tenant unions from across the country. So yes, a renter, but also more than a renter, and thinking of it more broadly as a person or anyone who doesn't have control over their housing. So that might mean houseless people. That might mean people in generally unstable housing situations. It might mean a renter, or it might mean a person who doesn't own their property outright. But this is just to keep in mind moving forward as we're thinking about our organizing, and also as we're thinking about what we're looking back at from the past. So yeah, next slide. So this is from our one of our first Socialist Night Schools on housing. It might have been our first Socialist Night School on housing, I think, on housing decommodification. There we discussed a book called In Defense of Housing. And this was one of the central points from that presentation. And just to read out the quote, ultimately the problem with making housing a commodity is that as such, living space will be distributed based on the ability to pay and provided to the extent that it produces a profit. But the ability to pay is unequal while the need for a place to live is universal. There is thus an unavoidable contradiction. So this is just to set things up broadly from what we've all sort of learned together from our Socialist Night School events and from the work we've been doing together. And this takes us into the next slide, which gets at this a little bit more specifically. So this is another quote. We didn't read this for today, but this is from a work by Nancy Fraser, a Marxist political theorist. And she writes, on the one hand, social reproduction is a condition of possibility for sustained capital accumulation. On the other hand, capitalism's orientation to unlimited accumulation tends to destabilize the very processes of social reproduction on which it relies. So to really bring it back to the ground, on the one hand, right, we need to be reproduced as workers. We need to be able to go to work the next day and the next day and the next day in order for capitalism to continue for the next day, the next day, and the next day. But on the other hand, when we're in situations such as with commodified housing, where rent increases, where we have things like gentrification, where we have uneven development, there's a contradiction that starts to emerge between being able to actually reproduce ourselves in a situation where we have rising rents and in many cases unlivable situations, and on the other hand, actually serving or operating as a worker. So that's what's being pointed out here as we're thinking about, again, the situation of housing. And this also builds on, I believe, actually the very first Socialist Night School event we did, which was on social reproduction quite a few months back. Next slide. So we've talked about what tenants are. So what is a tenant union? Now, the importance of thinking about these past few quotes that we're thinking about and thinking about this very point about contradiction is that there's a question of who is actually going to be, for lack of a better word, or for pun intended, who's going to exploit those contradictions? Is it going to be the ruling class, or is it going to be the working class? And that question really hinges on who's organized. So the ruling class, as we know, is organized in a whole manner of ways with all of its resources at its disposal. On the other hand, the working class is often not. And when we do think of the working class being organized, it's typically through the lens of labor unions. But another form from which we might think about being organized in organization is as a tenant union. And so here we have the definition of a tenant union as an organized association of tenants, often renters, but again, not necessarily only renters, formed to protect and further their rights and interests, acting and representing themselves in common. Most notably, as we'll get to in a bit, the rent strike is the sort of most most sort of dramatic, powerful form of leverage over landlords. As democratic socialists, though, again, thinking about housing decommodification, or what we've talked about over these last few months. As democratic socialists, the long-term goal of tenant unionism is to ultimately control the means of instead of production, again, social reproduction. So that means decommodifying housing, democratizing housing, decarbonizing and decolonizing housing, which are all things that DSA has put forward, for example, as part of the Green New Deal that DSA envisions. Next slide. So this takes us to some tenant organizing history. Again, when we think of working class struggle, we often think of labor unions, and we think maybe of big strikes. Even if there's not a particular big strike that you might be able to recall off the top of your mind, probably that's the image that's coming to you, especially in recent years with the strikes that we've been seeing across the country, such as the big teacher strikes. However, there are other actually fairly notable instances of where the working class was actually struggling at the point of reproduction, or at the point of social reproduction. And so we see this with some of these mass rent strikes, which we'll get to in a minute. These are current tenant unions on the left, some of which we might briefly touch on. But here on the right, historically, and just to touch on one, for example, the 1931 Barcelona rent strike, that was a strike that involved nearly 100,000 people, and was to push back against rent hikes and ultimately unlivable conditions. Interestingly, it was also coordinated by an anarcho-syndicalist labor union. And so a theme that we'll actually find as we proceed is that whether if you're identified with a particular socialist tendency, whether it's anarchist, social democratic, whatever it might be, maybe none of that, you'll see that it's across the board something that socialists have organized around. Next. So to briefly touch on the lower, a major strike, the Lower East Side rent strike of 1907. This emerged after rent was nearly tripled over the preceding few years. And Pauline Newman, who's shown here, she was later and better well known actually for being a labor organizer. Funny connection here, the ILGWU ultimately evolved into the union that many of us are familiar with here in New Haven, Unite Here. So this is way back. And she was involved in organizing garment strikes, or in strikes in garment factories across the country, as you see listed here. But before all of that, when she was 18 years old, she organized about 400 other women to coordinate a rent strike that ultimately involved 10,000 people. And the strike went on for a few months and made the New York Times. And there in the New York Times, she was actually called the East Side Joan of Arc. So right there, you see the little quote, the East Side Joan of Arc. It was for her leadership in the rent strike, actually. And many families, around 2,000 families, were able to renegotiate their rent. Both landlords and tenants claimed victory from the rent strike. But whatever the outcome was, it certainly had a big impact for thousands of people in the Lower East Side. And moving forward, she was quite active again as a socialist. And into the late 1910s, early 1920s, the Socialist Party became more and more active and more of a force in tenant organizing as well. Next slide. So this is one of the, to me, maybe one of the most significant examples for us in some sense moving forward. So the Glasgow rent strike of 1915, again, you'll notice a theme here. Often it's socialist women who are leading these rent strikes at a mass level. Mary Barber was ultimately elected to the Glasgow City Council in the years following this rent strike. And the rent strike was so powerful and has actually had such an impact both in Scotland and the UK in general that she's publicly commemorated for it. So you'll see this picture on the right over here. That's actually a statue of her today leading the rent strike. Next slide. So this takes us a bit in the sort of play-by-play of the rent strike, and the reason we have this displayed here is to think in terms of, again, escalation and the ability to escalate, and again the place of socialists in all of this work as it unfolds. So you'll see at early on there is a lack of housing built, although people are moving into Glasgow, which is at that time a heavily industrialized city and industrializing, and is serving a big role in the war effort in World War One. Very little is being built, and rents are actually are beginning to skyrocket through the war. So people become quite resentful of the situation that they're in, where on the one hand, many people are going off to war. On the other hand, rents of people's families are skyrocketing. Again, on the one hand, maybe people are working in the factories. They're getting somewhat of a wage increase, but even with the wage increases with the war effort, housing is actually rising and rising quite a bit. And so figures like Mary Barber start to really step up and take a lead role. And so you'll see that here in 1914. That's too bad. That came out much smaller than that. Oh well. In 1914, the Glasgow Women's Housing Association is founded, and they do block by block organizing. What's also significant here is that a party called the Independent Labor Party connects with this as well. And this is something that Mary Barber is a part of. With that connection, there's also connections made with the Glasgow Trades Council, which is the sort of union labor council in Glasgow. So there's a big connection here between socialists, tenant organizers, and labor organizers. Later on into 1915, more and more people start to crowd into the space of housing organizing and tenant organizing. And there's a big increasing pushback against the rent increases that are taking place. Again, similar, thinking back to the definition of tenant unionism that we provided earlier with democratic socialists seeking ultimately control over housing. This is what starts to emerge from the Independent Labor Party Housing Conference in 1915, where there is a call to municipalize housing, an outright, clear-cut call. Now, these issues begin to mount more and more, and a rent strike ultimately is called in a working class neighborhood in Glasgow in April. The Labor Party uses its platform to sound off on this. And so it's in the newspapers, it's going everywhere. A proposal is made to the city council to actually conduct an inquiry into the rent increases. That doesn't even pass. And so the publications, again, just continue to mount. And so within a few months, the rent strike starts spreading across Glasgow. And you have 10,000 people on strike. After that, as this is getting onto the agenda of Parliament, the strike is continuing to spread, and this time across not only all of Scotland but all of the United Kingdom. And so there's a lot of fear among the ruling class and the major political parties around what's going on here. And so finally, there's actually a response to look for the Parliament, for the national government to actually look into what's going on. Still, that's not doing anything. The rent strike gets bigger and bigger, reaches 15,000 people, eventually reaches 25,000 people. There's all sorts of eviction defense taking place. There's wildcat strikes occurring within workplaces. And more than that, a general strike in terms of labor in Glasgow is on the cusp of being called, this close to actually seeing a citywide combined rent strike and work strike in Glasgow. And this achieves a lot of victories, which brings us to the next slide. Okay, so The rent strike is ultimately called off because of this very first thing you'll see listed here on the slide. Rent is frozen to pre-war levels, so the increases that also were something like triple, double, triple, even more from pre-war are all reversed. Rent control is established. And actually, as the tenant movement continues to consolidate and sustain itself, of course, it's not near the level of a 25,000 person rent strike or a nationwide rent strike or a near nationwide rent strike. It is sustained in such a way where actually the UK, a few years later, puts together really its first comprehensive reform to create hundreds of thousands of units of public housing or council housing. And so again, that's something we see that we talk about in our housing justice project, right? Ultimately trying to link up a vision of both having a fighting force against landlords and a fighting force to really have just sustainable conditions, as well as one that can achieve real structural reform or structural change moving forward. And those are, again, many of the outcomes we see here. And again, in this image on the left here, you'll see, right? You'll see in the sign, great protest demonstration. This is during the rent strike, by the way, against increases of rents and in favor of municipal housing. So in case you're wondering, oh, are these things that are just sort of like superimposed? Is it just like saying the structural change thing people don't really care about and we're just like throwing it on over? No, it's just explicitly something that's being framed during these mass rent strikes. And that brings us to the next slide. So another example, which we won't go over as much in detail, is the Veracruz rent strike, and this lasted 4 years. So this was less led by a labor party and actually by an anarchist tenant union called the Revolutionary Tenants Union. It was led by two people, or two people are often credited as being major leads. One is this man depicted here named Heron Proal. He was known as the sort of Mexican Lenin. And another person named Maria Luisa Marin, who was among a significantly sized group of anarchist or anarcho-syndicalist women who were leaders of this tenants union. So they led actually 40,000 residents in a sustained rent strike. And what came out of this a year in, for example, was a sort of bill of rights for tenants or bill of tenants. They also throughout this were proposing municipalization and self-management of housing. And again, the backdrop of these grievances were rising rent that was just escalating and escalating in the 3 to 4 years prior. Next slide. So this brings us to sort of the outcomes again, one that was already mentioned, but here are some others. There was a brief rent law restricting rent increases, sort of like rent control. There was actually a proposal to set aside land, or there was actually land set aside for a worker settlement. Initially was seen as a success and then sort of fell out of favor. And then mediation boards were established as well. But there was a real fear, again, that this strike would especially again, following the 1917 Russian Revolution and all that was occurring, that this, also in the backdrop of the preceding Mexican Revolution, would also escalate into a revolutionary situation. Next slide. So this takes us to our final example. This is the Harlem rent strikes of 1963 to 64. The person you see circled here is a man named Jesse Gray. He was a member of the Communist Party. But again, thinking about this history, it's actually, and thinking about the connections and value of it, Jesse Gray actually in part was inspired as a sailor visiting Glasgow. And seeing that 4 decades later, the Glasgow tenants movement was still quite powerful and actually had someone elected to parliament. So this was something that he had seen in the 1950s. And when he had moved or had settled into Harlem. He got really started with this in founding the Lower Harlem Tenants Council in the late 1950s. And there were some small scale rent strikes in the late 1950s in 15 buildings in 1958, 59 that sort of served as a launch pad for more significant action that will occur later. And that brings us to the next slide. So again, there's a lot going on here, and there are a few important things that are going on in the years leading up to 1963. One is that there's a lack of public housing access. People similar to today, right? Long waiting lists. People really can't get in. Oh, cool! Someone in Harlem. Someone else in Harlem. My mother used to work in Harlem. In the years leading up, the conditions continue to deteriorate in housing in Harlem, and so there are protests that start to take place, specifically around eliminating rats. And rats become quite a big, even symbol for the campaign that starts to take place over the course of a year and a half. So there's picketing downtown. A strike starts to emerge in the summer and then into the fall. But then the publicity gets really dramatized and dramatic in December 1963, where the escalating rent strike finds itself in the courtroom. And so what tenants actually do is they actually bring a rat to the room and sort of reveal this large rat, and it makes all the front page newspapers really getting a lot of press on the issue. But it's to really highlight how bad the conditions are, and to show how bad it is, the cases that start to make the newspaper, and these are things that are happening already for years, but now they're starting to make the newspaper, are children who get bit by rats, for example, in their own homes, and things like this. So their campaign has started. There are rat marches. There's a Rats to Rockefeller campaign. Nelson Rockefeller was the governor, and they send a bunch of fake rats to his office. There are big supporting figures to the rent strike. I believe people, for example, I think James Baldwin are speaking at the rent strikes. There are all these, again, very significant figures who are out in solidarity. And really the main force, at least as a charismatic figure, is again, this man, Jesse Gray, who it's not clear whether sometimes he's actually claiming more buildings are on rent strike than there actually are. So he claims, for example, there are 519, though if you look at it, it's probably more like 200 buildings. But whatever the case is, it gets a lot of attention and sustained attention for many months. And so this brings us to the next slide. So it's important to understand that this is happening in a certain moment. Like overlapping this rent strike is actually the largest school boycott or student strike, one-day student strike in probably the history of this country, where 500,000 students don't attend school in New York City for a day or 2 days to call for desegregating schools. So there's a lot happening right in this moment. There's this term legalized rent strikes, meaning you can pay into court rather than paying to your landlord if they don't, for example, conduct certain repairs and bring things up to code. So that comes out of this rent strike. An emergency repair program where you can call in and there's actually a unit that comes in to repair different units. Again, a lot of these things are very understaffed though, so that's important to keep in mind. There's actually an anti-rat campaign from the city government. There are rent reductions and more legal services open up. Next slide. So lastly, we're talking again, from tenant organizing. Oh, we have a bit of a typo there. From tenant organizing to tenant control in Washington, D.C. So here, there's mass tenant organizing taking place in the 1970s. And we've talked a little bit about something called TOPA, Tenant Opportunity Purchase Act. It's something that is, well, I don't know if popular is the right word, but it's sort of getting around in housing discourse. And this is what emerges in the 1970s as something to be pushed. There's a greater context to this, which we don't have to get into right now. But ultimately, in the decades following, up to 20,000 sales are actually made from landlords to tenants because of the Tenant Opportunity Purchase Act. And a lot of those, hundreds, if not thousands of those, are limited equity cooperatives. To be more specific about what this means is that if a landlord is going to sell their building, they have to first sell it. They have to first see if the tenants are actually going to buy the building. So the tenants get the first opportunity to buy, and with the Tenant Opportunity Purchase Act, there are actually some other broader support mechanisms, such as funding, such as administrative help, low-cost loans, or rather low-interest loans, maybe even zero-interest loans that occur around this. So yes, as June mentions, right of first refusal. There was actually a prior right of first refusal here in DC in 1974, but it becomes a more comprehensive piece of legislation, and it's still to this day supporting people taking over their buildings. Next slide. This is just a sketch of it. We're not going to go over this in detail, but this is actually from the Washington D.C. City government website, showing this outlines the steps to TOPA for taking over a building. If in this case you live in a 2 to 4 unit building, they have other ones that are smaller, bigger. That's provided. Next slide. So what are really the lessons? What's the point of all this, right? Like, who cares? Well, there are some consistent lessons from all of this, right? Clearly, there are grievances. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here in some sense. But those grievances are being named, right? The organizing that's taking place is doing the job of having those grievances named, and not necessarily or not solely from just individuals who are deciding to name them. That's not possible, right? It's collectively taking place. And that brings us next, right? A base is being built around that. And that sometimes is happening at a block by block level, or it necessarily is happening at a block by block level. But with certain moments that start to sort of arise as this work is taking place, we sometimes see these mass rent strikes occur, right? And so action is being taken and sustained. And that's a key part here, right? Where a lot of these rent strikes we're seeing here are really sustained ones, from months to years, even sometimes. But more than that, through the organization that's occurring, the power is actually leveraged to achieve some structural change as well. So it's not necessarily solely rent reductions that occur, though sometimes that's the case, as we see in the 1907 Lower East Side rent strike. Sometimes, as in Glasgow, or as to a degree in Harlem, we see these broader structural changes taking place. There are other really important examples to keep in mind. For example, actually rent strikes were a big component of anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. There were rent strikes, again, in the thousands, sometimes even more, across South Africa as part of waging a strike against apartheid. And that's something that has sort of been lost, unfortunately, in a lot of recent years talk about anti-apartheid struggle, but rent strikes were absolutely crucial to that, and so was tenant organizing. So whether it's at a block by block level, at a citywide level, at a statewide level, or even at a nationwide level, rent strikes and tenant unionism has been a big force for at least ameliorating our conditions under capitalism, if not bringing about some structural changes. Next slide, I believe, is just the sources. So just so people see where this was gotten from. Next slide is that if there are any questions before we move on, please feel free to ask, and write stack in the chat if you have a question. Yes, we can do that. Yes, we can share the slides.
Looks like Jessica has a question.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering, this can be talked about later if it's not like right for right now. But I was wondering, how does land back and those values of like indigenous sovereignty, how does that fit in with tenant organizing?
I think that's some. I think that's something actually we can talk about more broadly as part of the discussion that we'll have following. I think that's a great question, and I think that's something we should keep in mind as we proceed through all of this. I will bring up one thing that's occurring right now, actually in Long Island in New York, where there is currently uh, an action taking place on Long Island around indigenous sovereignty and sovereignty camp. Exactly, yeah. So I think that's something we can open up for later, but thank you for that question.
Valerie's on stack.
Hey, I've been participating in the campaign of Craig Schley in Harlem as of recently, and he emphasized income targeted housing, and was talking about that through, an elected official standpoint. I'm wondering if you've ever put in conjunction this tenant organizing history with other initiatives that come from elected officials around this issue?
Specifically around, for example, income target, like around like inclusionary housing and things like that. Is that what you mean, or?
Yeah, I guess it's like generally trying to overcome gentrification and empowering, workers that struggle with rent and housing.
Yeah, so I think a number, and we'll get to this a little bit very soon, around the tenant unions that are operating today. A lot of them are using the action, either explicitly in the actions that they're taking, or as part of just their ongoing organizational activity to target exactly issues like that. And so you'll see, for example, like the LA Tenants Union explicitly is talking about like tackling gentrification, reversing certain laws at the municipal level that are enabling gentrification to happen. There are a number of examples, and to me, one of the best examples again is the Los Angeles Tenants Union on actually this issue that you're talking about. Okay, so maybe hand it off to Alice now.
I think actually Dan is.
Dan, sorry.
Yeah, no worries. All right, so this is the Rebel Steps podcast that we listened to beforehand. So this is the third episode of their rent strike collection. And this focused on two different tenant unions. It was the Ithaca Tenants Union and the Bushwick Bed-Stuy Tenant Coalition. Next slide. So for the Ithaca Tenants Union, we heard from two organizers, Kat, a Cornell Rising senior and a co-founder of the Ithaca Tenants Union, and Daisy, a graphic designer working in Ithaca. By crossing the gap between, an Ivy League university and working class members of Ithaca, they were able to establish, a blend of cultural differences into a tenant union. It was founded late 2019 to protect both community members and students from rising rents and poor conditions. So it was created pre-pandemic to stop the rising costs of their housing situation. And one of the places that they started with was the Tompkins County Workers Center, which is a labor organization that supports workers in the community with any issue they have related to employment through like a hotline, local community union organizing, and they have a living wage campaign as well. And then they also linked up with the local Ithaca DSA chapter in creating this tenant union, which is pretty sweet. So they're fairly new organizations, so they're still deciding how to structure it. Once they have more funding on the ground, it sounds like they want to split up their tenant unions into kind of smaller ones that focus on, say, a particular neighborhood, LLC landlord, just so that you could focus on that particular person instead of being like a citywide kind of thing. Next slide. So one of the big things that they got a lot of news about was the freeze rent campaign in Ithaca, and it started in March as a response to COVID-19. And they were successfully passed the cancellation of rent through the Common Council. I believe 6-4 was the vote. And they were the first city in the United States to do this. They got this done by organizing throughout within their tenant union membership, which included local organizers and people within the community and some that had never really organized before. This included like a 3-day phone zap that involved talking to the Ithaca Common Council, gathering thousands of signatures for a petition. They also kept close contact with the mayor, and one of their bigger events that they held initially was they co-sponsored an event with the Party for Socialism and Liberation with like Cancel the Rents car caravan in order to get more exposure. And from that caravan, also, I guess, a small group of protesters actually showed up outside the mayor's house during the vote, something he probably wasn't happy about, but kudos to them. People who have economic hardships due to COVID, so they can have their back rent paid off by the state. So the landlord still gets paid, and there's some assistance provided by the state. Weirdly, this proposal is still sitting with the New York Health Department. And that's because due to the pandemic, the governor signed an executive order that requires any local orders to get approved by the state's health department. And I believe it's still stopped there today. Next slide. And then, so their long-term goals is just trying to organize more across Ithaca to build like kind of a working class solidarity. I imagine this involves working closely with the Tompkins County Worker Center to kind of interconnect the housing issues with labor ones, fair wage, all that stuff. So they worked with other local groups that are embedded in different communities, such as the Multicultural Resource Center. And this center was formed to address the lack of ethnic, cultural, cross-community understandings in schools and communities. So just that whole separation of basically like, this is a white school, this is a person of color school. So it's all about eliminating racial justice and being more inclusionary of indigenous rights. And then basically it's trying to establish a more extensive base will mean that they'll be able to mobilize more quickly to protect individual tenants from evictions. So they have everyone's contact information. They could whip up a quick text, email, phone call that could just mobilize the community, in like hours or so, which would probably be impossible without this. Next slide. So this, moving on to more downstate in Brooklyn. So there's the Regal Tenants Council. We heard from Ali, who is a member of the Regal Tenants Council. And this is part of the greater Bushwick Bed-Stuy tenant coalition. So this council, they focused on organizing tenants that live in Regal buildings. And they delivered a letter to the Regal Management Services informing them that they would not be paying rent until their demands were met. Like a typical landlord, they did not recognize this tenant council and seek to talk to individual tenants to see if they could break the strike. Excuse me. In response, the Regal Tenants Council sent legally minded responses around harassment, but they didn't actually use a lawyer. I don't know how they did this, but they basically were able to create some legal like documents and letters to do so. And then another method of harassment that they used was sending out lease non-renewal notices, which is basically just like, hey, your lease ended. We're not going to renew it. Since you're in a lot of pain, we'll basically just fill in someone who can pay these absurd rent increase. This is pretty challenging to push back on because landlords are split up in all these different properties into different LLCs, so it's hard to attack that corporation as a whole. And basically, like, there's a lot of lawyers that don't really want to do like a class action lawsuit. They're saying that it's not the same person, even though it is the same person. And then similar to Ithaca, the direct action that the Regal Tenants Council is focused on is cancellation of rent and stopping evictions. Next slide. All right, this is for the Bushwick Bed-Stuy Tenant Coalition. So with the Regal Tenant Council, they joined forces with the other tenant unions. It's a collection of 8 tenant associations that are in Bushwick and Bed-Stuy, including the Crown Heights Tenant Union. They had a first event in July, which was awesome. They got over 100 people to come out in the local park in Bushwick and support cancel rent, being all loud and proud, everything. Then they had a group also called Mikasa Resista, which I guess was doing a lot of anti-gentrification and broader work on the issues pre-pandemic. So this group was focused on, I guess, a fracking gas pipeline was attempted to be built through Brooklyn. And I mean, that just sounds absurd, especially with like a very supposedly liberal place as Brooklyn, that they would constitute a fracking gas line. But basically it's working with vulnerable communities that are facing, inhumane conditions. And it doesn't matter if they're working against corporate landlords or these oil gas pipeline barons. They just will do anything to make a profit. Next slide. All right, so it is the coalition's more a coalition of associations. They are specifically organized by building or landlord, so that they can operate differently depending on said landlord. They're structured differently, each one. So some of them have like a top level down hierarchy, like a president, vice president kind of motion, while others are just, it's an organizing body of people who volunteer as needed. And the goal of this coalition is to affect a direct political change. They want to make it a norm that basically every building has a tenant association tied to it. And then if they find out that that landlord owns multiple buildings, to organize around that landlord. They're acting as a unified group. They're committed to doing outreach, planning actions. It's a very democratic horizontal leadership structure that allows anyone to get involved, and it really, the ebbs and flows of the organization allow it very easily for someone to move from one action to the other. Next slide. So the similarities and differences between the two, I mean, both tenant unions were engaged in their local communities around housing justice. It didn't matter that one city was, much larger than the other. Both tenant unions established an organized group of people who would like to change the housing injustices that we see every day: rising rents, inhumane conditions, etc. Tenants, the Ithaca Tenants Union was started at a private university in a small college town, and like that university is directly responsible for the rising costs of that community. But a couple of people from that group acknowledged these issues, and they created a diverse union. It wasn't just Cornell students involved. It was the Tompkins Working Center, the Multicultural Resource Center, and then the Bushwick Bed-Stuy Tenant Coalition. It's kind of like ideally what you want to see in a tenant coalition, just because it focuses on that landlord. They're creating these units that can move and try to hopefully legally, I guess, like prosecute these landlords in a class action lawsuit because of what they're doing, especially with this like fracking oil pipeline. Does anyone have any questions regarding the Rebel Steps podcast? And yes, use the corpse of Robert Moses. All right, yeah, I'll pass that on to Alice, or Liz, sorry. That's not up to you.
Hi, I'm Liz with Central Connecticut, she, her. I'm here to just do a brief overview of what's going on with tenant unions in this moment. We've still got a lot of activity. I'm going to start with this slide on tenant union law in Connecticut, and this is going to come up a little bit later. There is not a lot of legal recognition for tenant unions, if any, on a state level. The term tenant union isn't defined anywhere in Connecticut statutes or case law. There's no recognition or certification process for a tenant union under CT state law, unlike a labor union. The obvious downside to all this is you can't directly confront a landlord and force them to negotiate with the union. Excuse me. The upside is they're a little less fettered, unlike how labor unions can have their hands tied by the National Labor Relations Act. Next. Oh God. Could someone remind me what that little thingy means?
Subsection, right?
Yes, subsection 47A-20 prevents landlords from evicting tenants, raising rents, or decreasing services, you know, your utilities, without cause for 6 months after a tenant joins a tenant union. Subsection 47A-33 gives tenants a defense in eviction cases if they have reported their landlord to government officials. Possibly, this could be argued as protection for members of tenant unions or associations via subsection 47A-33, because tenant unions are an essential vehicle for ensuring that tenants are able to report their landlord's code violations to public officials. That is correct. It is not defined. A tenant union is not defined. I am not a lawyer. I've not looked at these laws in detail. It's very complicated. I don't recommend laymen look directly at the laws. Next slide. Here's an example of some tenant union laws, or tenant union cards. They potentially have significant legal implications. Paying dues like labor unions is a structural test. They can be symbolically or collectively binding. These right here, these are example of labor union cards. We got Unite here and the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. Woo. Next slide. And I apologize. I'm a little stuffed up right now. So where are we with tenant unions at this moment in time in the fall of 2020? Next slide. So we're seeing a big growth in tenant unions. And this is not just kicked off by people being unable to pay rent during the pandemic. And I'll come back to this a little later. But the Autonomous Tenant Union Network held their first conference this year with 15 affiliated unions and an additional 57 tenant unions in attendance. The Los Angeles Tenant Union has doubled in size from 4,000 to 8,000 members since the pandemic began. So similar to what we saw, the increase in DSA membership during the 2010s. The DC Tenant Union reported more than double the responses to their housing hotline since the pandemic began. So interest has gone way up. If you had a graph, it would be like, whoop. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, the most difficult hurdle for tenant unions to clear is legal recognition. In most places, there exists no firm set of laws or agencies, such as those governing labor unions, that can make your landlord engage in collective bargaining or meeting with the tenants as a collective. They're going to try to go behind people's backs and deal with it on a case basis to break the rent strike, or they can harass and retaliate. Recognition is proving especially difficult for the newer tenant unions that only coalesced during the COVID-19 pandemic. So that is our biggest issue. Most places don't have any protection for people in tenant unions. Your landlord is not legally obligated to recognize that you have organized. Next slide. So pre-pandemic, as we all know and lived through, in 2008, the economy went into a big recession. As a consequence of the so-called economic recovery from that 2008 recession, we saw rising housing costs, especially in the East and West coasts. And as a result, the tenant unions and associations started springing up or being revitalized. At the time, rent was not the most pressing issue for every tenant union. They were also targeting issues like habitability, in the case of like severely neglected properties, places where people couldn't really live. Obviously, there were fees and rent increases being combated. Racism, landlords like evicting people or harassing them on the basis of race, targeted harassment in general, retaliation by landlords for tenants who dared to organize and oppose them. Next slide. Ithaca Tenants Union has in recent months gotten up to quite a few activities. Here is a brief overview of some of them. They have established a tip line for people facing the threat of eviction, whether through legal or illegal means. I've mentioned harassment and retaliation. Basically, if you can imagine how hellish this is, a landlord deliberately destroying your apartment or home and generally making your life miserable to force you to leave. That's basically what an illegal eviction is. But people who call the tip line are directed directly to specially trained union stewards. The tip line also serves the purpose of helping the ITU with outreach and with mapping where evictions are occurring. It's going to help them figure out there's certain neighborhoods where the threat of eviction is widespread. If it's properties owned by a particular landlord or particular landlord company. Here's where things are heating up. An eviction blockade brigade/network is being organized. This is an especially useful tactic against illegal evictions. That physical confrontation tends to change someone's mind pretty quick if they're going to try to drag you out of your house. And there's like a couple dozen people in their way. Also, back in early August, the ITU blockaded Ithaca's city court. That's where eviction cases are being heard in most cases, and the neighboring police department. And they were making demands to cancel rent, which, as we've heard previously, that's going forward. And in general, they were also demanding more protection for tenants. Next slide. All right, we're gonna go out to Illinois. Question from Julie. The police will not help you. The police are in many cases called in to aid in eviction or be the main evicting force. They will usually take the side of the landlords. But Hyde Park in Chicago, there we find the Mac Properties Tenant Union. In late October, so just a couple weeks ago, they went on a heat strike protesting Mac Properties' illegal negligence of heating in their buildings. Chicago has a code in place saying that you can't allow the heat to fall below a point in the mid-60s Fahrenheit during the day and during the night. Once it hits September or so, needless to say, a lot of landlords are not listening to that. Organizers speaking with the press also discussed illegal evictions and general illegal neglect of the Mac property buildings with the press. So they spread a lot of awareness. We're in the Northeast, so we don't quite think that much about it, but Chicago is basically the New York of that part of the country. Next slide. Going back to Brooklyn, as have been mentioned, as we discussed before, it's an ongoing struggle in New York City. So the borough has been a hotbed for tenant organizing, which really began taking off in the 2010s because gentrification efforts were rapidly accelerating. People were being forced out of their homes by rising rent caused by them building hipster coffee shops and WeWorks and stuff. So this struggle's already been discussed quite a bit. There's dozens of tenant union in Brooklyn. You could probably devote a whole presentation, but their struggle has become even more important in the midst of this COVID-19 crisis. Next slide. So, what successes have tenant unions succeeded in? 2019, before COVID-19 made its appearance, the Kansas City Tenant Union passed the local Tenant Bill of Rights. As we've heard before, Ithaca Tenant Union passed a local rent cancellation pending state approval. I really hope it gets through. Kansas City, New Orleans, Philadelphia, and again, Ithaca Tenant Union have shut down eviction courts, both online and in person. People have been mobbing those public court calls. And they are not evicting people now. Next slide. So, another big news item has been the CDC Eviction Moratorium. And while that has aided some people, this is, I think, we can all agree, this is largely an attempt to demoralize and distract tenant organizing and general leftist organizing efforts. The confusion this moratorium has caused limits our ability to organize. It places the burden of fighting against eviction entirely on individual tenants. Landlords can still file eviction proceedings. A tenant seeking to avoid eviction has to legally pledge to pay their current rent to the best of their ability And worse, all the accumulated back rent when the moratorium lifts. Huge trap, huge debt trap. Next slide. The eviction moratorium, both the federal and state moratoriums are wholly insufficient. Eviction is still happening in Connecticut and around the country in the midst of a pandemic, which is claiming, for instance, today, yesterday, November 13th, 1,300 people died of COVID-19. Evictions are still, illegal evictions are a big problem. As I said before, harassment and destruction of what is considered the landlord's property. You can drive a tenant out, or you can just tell them to get lost without going through the court. You know they can't afford a lawyer. You can just go. The landlord's just gonna go get out. Legal evictions under this moratorium. Any rent owed prior to March is a reason they can legally evict you. If the tenant hasn't heard about the eviction moratorium, the landlord's going to do whatever because everything is on the tenant. Next slide. What's happening right now in Connecticut? Well, there's our own Central Connecticut DSA Housing Justice Project. We're meeting tomorrow at 11 a.m. for our weekly meeting. We, Central CT and other DSA memberships are organizing. And we are kicking off organizing efforts in New Haven, upon which Central CT DSA is centered. There's Worcester Square and East Rock organizing efforts underway right now because we have a lot of people living as tenants in New Haven.
So I can jump in here with a little more information about the New Haven organizing work. Yeah, some context about the DSA Housing Justice work, or the DSA Housing Justice Project.
Thanks very much, Alice.
So the Housing Justice Project started meeting in June in large part to support the Cancel Rent Coalition. And I can drop a link with that petition in the chat a little bit later. But essentially the petition calls for the state of Connecticut to cancel rent, to stop evictions indefinitely, or cancel rent for the duration of the pandemic, including back rent, stop evictions indefinitely, and enact a freeze on rent increases because the affordable housing issue was a problem long before the pandemic, and it's definitely not getting better now. So that was sort of where we initially started in looking at the how cancel rent has been pushed in other areas. Having a strong tenant base, an organized group of tenants has been really vital to that work. So within the DSA membership, we decided to start organizing, and we started with our own DSA members. Because the Housing Justice Project had a lot of members in the New Haven area, we started by focusing there. And apologies if there are questions coming in the chat, I will answer them later, but I'm gonna just keep rolling through this for now. So we started by reaching out to our DSA members because we knew that there would already be some interest. And it also helped us to identify what the issues that people are currently facing, what are the struggles in their housing situations. We started in that DSA membership outreach, we contacted a member who had already done some informal organizing. Essentially, his landlord had tried to enact a really steep increase of, I think it was 20% rent increase. And this was during the pandemic. He talked to his neighbors, he contacted his alders, and essentially created enough of a hassle for the landlord that the landlord backed down and decided not to increase the rent, at least for now. So based on those conversations and some other interest in Wooster Square, we decided to start organizing there. And we started with a couple meetings, I believe it was about a month ago. We met with a few tenants to hear about the issues that they're facing and their interest in organizing. We set up a few canvases, or actually just the one canvas, working with the local tenants to try and start organizing them with their neighbors. And from there, because a New Haven tenant organization sort of must be bigger than one neighborhood, we're identifying where to start organizing next. Because within our own membership, we had a few members in the East Rock neighborhood, we identified that as a good next stop spot. We actually earlier today had our first tenant meeting in the East Rock neighborhood. Originally, we had planned to canvass leading up to that meeting, but with the spike of the COVID cases, we decided to pause canvassing for the moment and instead flyered the area. And we were still able to make connections with a few tenants in the area. So overall, I think it was a good first step towards organizing in the East Rock area. So what's the next step? Where do we go from here? One of the big challenges, especially with cases continuing to go up, is how do we move forward while prioritizing everyone's safety? So again, we've paused canvassing, but traditional wisdom says face-to-face, one-on-one communication is really the best for organizing. So how do we go about trying to set up those one-on-one conversations without door knocking, and whether that's flyering with our contact info, these socially distanced outdoor meetings, we're still sort of trying to work out exactly what is the best organizing structure during a pandemic. Luckily, there already is some guidance out there because obviously there's quite a bit of organizing coming up out of the start of the pandemic. So yeah, we'll just keep working on that. There's also quite a few open research questions about what a tenant union could accomplish here in Connecticut. And we heard through the previous presentations about what is already happening with other tenant unions, what historically tenant unions have been able to accomplish. So we really need to understand what is the landscape we're looking at here in Connecticut and what are the issues that we're going to face. So for example, in our initial research, we've already figured out that essentially Connecticut has a law that blocks cities from enacting local rent control. So rent control has been preempted across the state as a sort of handoff of you don't get rent control, you get fair rent commissions. And these fair rent commissions are established for each city with the idea that they would control and eliminate excessive rental charges. So these commissions are woefully underpowered and underutilized. For the city of New Haven, for example, a city with 130,000 residents, we have 2 members on the Fair Rent Commission, and we only got the second member in January. 130,000 people in a city, and the one person is supposed to manage massively increasing rents. And if you have been reading the New Haven Independent, you've seen quite a bit of continued purchasing of development and this agreement of affordable housing when that is not actually affordable to the residents of the city because it's based on, it's a percentage of the area median income, and it's not sufficient at all. So yeah, understanding this landscape helps us figure out where to put our resources. The other research question is also finding out who are the landlords, who are the slumlords, what are the properties they own. As was mentioned earlier, often these landlords are sort of protected by layers of LLCs. So we need to figure out like what's the power map, who holds power over housing in the state of Connecticut. And the more we know, the more prepared we'll be against attacks by landlords, and we can inoculate against that kind. And then finally, we're also looking to build capacity. There's a lot of work to be done, building relationships with tenants, building relationships with elected officials, researching landlords and the laws around housing. And we have to make sure that our organizing structure is sustainable, that this isn't coming down to a very small core of people. we are looking to kickstart a tenant union, to start some tenant organizing, but we recognize that a tenant union has to be autonomous. It has to be tenant run. So we want to know as much as we can about the laws and where power sits in the state of Connecticut in regards to housing. So we want to have as much information to share with tenants as possible, but the eventual goals, whether it's rent cancellation, rent freeze, rent control, housing decommodification on a larger scale, whatever the goal is going to inevitably have to be decided by the tenants themselves who are in the tenant union. So our work here is really to start that work and to try and like lead some organizing while recognizing that this work has to be done by the tenants themselves.